Well, it's obviously the case that being influenced how things are framed is often completely irrational. There are no good reasons for preferring meat that is 75% lean to meat that is 25% fat, or for thinking that a basketball player with a 90% success rate is better than one with a 10% failure rate. But what I'm interested in are the situations where framing effects are much more complicated, and where using frames and manipulating them is actually a way of making better decisions. And the basic idea that runs through the book is that different ways of framing things open up different sets of reasons. They make available different types of emotional engagement. They bring different values into play. And by being flexible and creative in those ways, by making oneself open to different ways of framing problems, that actually helps us to make better decisions. And I talk about a number of different ways in which framing effects can be a positive force. And I'm talking really about situations where I think it's perfectly rational to be influenced by how things are framed and to frame things in multiple ways, and even when one knows that it's the same thing being framed in different ways. So here are a couple of examples, one individual and one very social. So the individual example is self-control. So almost by definition, people have problems with self-control when they want something that's right in front of them more than they want a long-term goal or a project. You want the drink in front of you more than you want tomorrow's clear head and early start. But if that's the case, how's self-control even possible? Aren't you always going to do what you most want to do? Well, framing and reframing is a very good strategy here. Rethink that drink to take away its attractiveness. Focus on what foregoing the drink will make possible. Remember the last hangover you had. Concentrate on what you want to do tomorrow morning, and then reflect upon all the things that will become possible if you make an early start. So people who are good at exercising self-control are typically good at doing all these things. And really what they're doing is creating their very own framing effect. They come to value the same thing differently, depending on how it's framed. And they use those frames and manipulate them in order to bring about a desired outcome that's better for them in the long run. Now let's look at another example. It's a very topical one, as I'm recording this a couple of days after the insurrection in Washington, D.C. So why is our political culture so divided, not just in America, but across the world? People often say that the divisions are all on so-called values issues. But actually, when you drill down, values often span political and cultural divides. So gun control is a values issue, but both sides typically share the same basic values. Whether you're supportive of gun rights or of gun control, you care about freedom, you care about safety, and you care about rights. So where do the differences come from? Well, the view that I present in the book is that the differences that are standardly described as differences in values are better understood as differences in how people frame the issues and the values. From one way of looking at it, safety is all about personal safety and self-defense. But from another perspective, safety is all about the safety of a community. From that perspective, freedom is the freedom to live one's life in an environment where deadly weapons are regulated. Others, though, see freedom as a private sphere surrounded by a line that the government cannot cross. And framing of rights goes the same way. On the one hand, you can frame them as rights to possess, to use, to defend property. And on the other, you can present them as rights to live in a society that values and protects collective security. So how can you cross the divide? How will these very different ways of looking at the world ever be brought into some sort of contact? And the simple answer is that that's just not going to happen until we learn how to frame things in the way that others frame them. And that means not just being able to see that complicated issues can be framed in different ways, but also being able simultaneously to feel the conflicting pull of multiple perspectives. And if people do that well enough, then they'll find themselves valuing the same thing differently in different frames. In other words, they'll be creating their own framing effect, and that will help them to understand and to appreciate the views of people that are so diametrically opposed to them. And in the last chapters of the book, I present a four-step model based on research in different areas of psychology that presents a sort of roadmap or blueprint for how this way of developing frame-sensitive reasoning or frame-sensitive flexibility can be used in these sort of highly polarized, highly charged issues and discussions.